Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. Be careful what you wish for. 4 years after the democratic protest sparked the start of the Syrian war, this adage rings even more true. Is there still a hope for Western-style democracy in Syria, and if so, at what cost? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Ribal Al Assad, a leading Syrian campaigner for democracy and human rights. Ribal, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Now, 4 years after the uprising began with the hopes of making Syria more open, more democratic, do you still hold on to that hope? Do you believe that that is still a realistic expectation?
Well, Oksana, we have to start with, for the start, we have to know that we always must keep hope because, as you know, the country have been completely destroyed. Over 200,000 lives have been lost, millions of refugees. Of course, we have to still have hopes, and I'm still hoping always for the better.
Well, I obviously do too, but the question is whether how you distribute your priorities, whether the first priority is actually bringing peace to your country or whether the priority is still to persist with the political change. That's the gist of my question.
I mean, we have called from the beginning that it must have been a peaceful transitional change. People, must understand that we cannot build the future of our country based on violence. We cannot build our country over 200,000 bodies. This is a disaster that we are facing today. It should, and we have always been calling, and we are still for a peaceful transition change. And I think that's the only way forward. Mm-hmm. I think it was crazy just to think or believe that an armed insurgency, would be the best solution to move forward. And I still believe that the best way forward is a political solution, which will bring all sides together, all peaceful people who genuinely believe in diplomatic and peaceful change.
But, Ribal, I think that's the critical thing that you just said. You mentioned about bringing all sides, and then you mentioned all peaceful people. But the problem is, of course, that not all sides in the Syrian conflict are peaceful. How do you really identify those who should be brought to the table to discuss the future of Syria?
Yes, Oksana, I think the problem from the beginning was that we did not identify those sides. From the beginning, the West has stood aside, the international community has stood aside and let countries, regional countries such as Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to take the lead. And as you know, these kind of countries do not want a peaceful, democracy in Syria because they know very well that they could be next. So instead of, instead of the Western countries encouraging real representative, people or opposition to come, they have allowed those countries to pick and choose an opposition that was mainly Islamist in nature. And as you all remember, how it, how they set up the, at the time, the Syrian National Council, which was mainly made up of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then it took Ms. Clinton 18 months to recognize that those people do not actually represent the Syrian people.
Well, Ribal, I totally agree with you on your assertion that the Syrian conflict was very much misrepresented from the very beginning. But before we go there, you make no secret that you happen to be a cousin of the current president, Bashar al Assad, even though you've been long very, very critical of him. You criticized him sharply long before the Arab Spring and before he became a pariah in the eyes of the West. I'm going to ask you, though, if over the last 4 years you've ever sympathized with him and the kind of decisions, very difficult decisions that he had to take regarding the future of your country.
Unfortunately, Oksana, Bashar could have done things, or President Assad could have done things differently in, in Syria, and we hope that he could have done things differently. We hope that he could have allowed those, political parties to exist in Syria and to be able to be formed peacefully. This would have not allowed those Islamist groups to take advantage of this chaos that's going on. This wouldn't have allowed countries, regional countries, who wanted to see their own interest, by placing those Islamist groups as a forefront. And unfortunately, he did not listen, and he did not want to listen. And I don't think it was because of him. I think mainly it was because the people he was surrounded by.
I agree with you only partially here, because it's true that some people within Bashar al-Assad's circle perhaps had their personal reasons to act one way or another. But at the same time, as somebody who's covered this conflict from the very beginning, I know that from the very beginning, in addition to those pro-democracy protests that were taking place all around the country, you also had terrorist attacks taking place all around the country. And even if we take the incident of Dara, the one that is often cited, when the army supposedly brutally suppressed the protesters, I know for a fact that from the very beginning, within that crowd that came out to protest the detention of those teenagers, there were armed people. There were people who were shooting. There were people who stormed the local TV center. So are you ready to concede here that from the very beginning, the Syrian military, the Bashar al-Assad circle, had real reasons to be concerned about the security in the country, knowing that there are a lot of fighters, a lot of weapons streaming into the country?
Yes, it's true, Oksana, but usually when you see that there is, as they call it, like if it is a conspiracy or whatever coming from whatever other regional countries, the way to counter it, it's not by using force, it's not by using, just taking the decision unilaterally to go against, if there are such Islamist groups. You first of all have to build a national unity government. You have to bring people together, people who believe in building the future of Syria peacefully together to get, into a general democratic system. Because as you know, only a genuine democracy is able to protect those minority groups in Syria and the beautiful mosaic that we have in Syria, actually. Unfortunately, they didn't. Unfortunately, they did not do that. We hoped really that they would bring together all the people who really, at heart, were genuine into, seeing a peaceful transitional change, and be able to all work together into protecting Syria, into making a transitional change, into allowing elections, into allowing political parties to exist.
With all due respect, there were some changes, some movements on the political front to make the Syrian political system more liberalized. Surely it wasn't enough. I'm not going to discuss the quality of those changes, but I would like to bring you back again to the military sort of dimension of that conflict, because, I'm not going to defend here the military tactics of the Assad government. The death toll in Syria, as you said, speaks for itself, but we also have to keep in mind that a significant portion of that death toll belongs to the Syrian army, to the soldiers, to the security forces personnel, which suggests that this conflict wasn't one-dimensional. It wasn't just the army killing innocent civilians. It was an active combat from both sides. And my question to you is, what other ways were open to President Assad and his circle other than to suppress those Islamist rebels militarily? Do you believe in a political deal that you alluded to with groups like ISIS, with groups like Al-Nusra, with groups like the Islamic Front, and many other groups, even the so-called moderate rebels, whatever that term means?
I'm full aware that, a lot of people, around 80,000 of the people who have died, of those 200,000 belong to the military, and the security services in Syria. I'm fully aware of that, Oksana. We're not saying that it's one-sided, of course. We know very well that it has been, and there has been a lot of Islamist groups, from Al-Qaeda to Al-Nusra to many Salafi groups who actually were at the helm of the Free Syrian Army, which was the Supreme Military Council of the Free Syrian Army was mainly made up of Salafi extremist groups. And I've been warning from that for the past 4 years. I've spoken at the European Parliament, at the British Parliament, everywhere, warning of those groups. And I was the one also warning against arming those rebel groups, because they are not moderate as people are trying to show them. We all know that. But again, I repeat and say, the way it was not to deal with it as the regime has done. You first have to build a strong national unity government to be able together to defy and fight those Islamists. Alone, as we have seen today, you cannot do much because you are seen by the world as your dictatorship. You have not allowed political parties. You were trying, as you said, yes, they have made some changes, but they were very slow in the beginning. They said we need time to study the new constitution. We need time to study how the laws, how to set up new political groups. Well, it took too long. Things were moving very fast in the Middle East. Things have started changing in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, and of course, people who have seen what was going on there, also were encouraged by that and wanted to say, these changes in Syria. So we should have not awaited. We should have not wasted any time.
Okay, Ribal, point taken. You believe that the Syrian government acted way too slowly, but let me ask you about the actions of the pro-democracy opposition here. Earlier on, you alluded to the very destructive Saudi and Turkish involvement in the Syrian conflict that allowed to turn it from a political struggle into a sectarian one. One thing, though, I don't understand is why people like you or other democratic activists didn't see it coming, because after all, I mean, your own father has been involved in dealing with the Hama uprising in the 80s. There were calls to turn Syria into an Islamic state all the way back in the early 80s. And the Syrian government has been dealing with this issue for quite some time. Wasn't it more or less inevitable that those religious extremists that existed in Syria and that were in abundance in the neighborhood, that they would seize on this opportunity, that they would use pro-democracy demonstrations for their own purposes? Well,
Oksana, just let me say from the beginning that my father was not responsible for the Hama incident.
I never suggested that, but he was involved.
No, I know, but okay, and let me just say again that my father has been telling them, and my father has been telling the President Assad, the father, I mean President Ribal Al Assad, how you know that we needed some change in Syria. That the only way that we could protect Syria, the future of Syria and the future generation, is if we have a genuine democracy in Syria. He was, of course, against Islamists, and he is still against Islamists, and we are still against Islamists. And we have been warning from all of these things, you know. We have been warning from corruption. We have been warning from those people who have been, you know, using, the regime to amass huge fortunes. And we needed that change because we knew that any time that this kind of uprising would happen, that the Islamists would, of course, jump on it. We know that the Islamists, with the backing of countries, regional countries, as I said, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi, would jump on such a situation because they would be terrified of seeing democratic change in their neighborhood.
With all due respect, I don't remember many pro-democracy groups coming out early in the uprising and distancing themselves very sharply from those groups. I think for the first 2 years into the Syrian conflict, the idea was that the enemy of Bashar al-Assad was my friend, and that applied as much to the West as to the domestic opposition groups in Syria. Was it not the case?
No, I'm not sure about the others, but I'm talking about myself and our groups, for example. We were never with those Islamist groups. It was never, you know, I've been warning, and not for the first, from the first, days, actually. I was warning of this, Islamist opposition. I was warning from the Syrian National Council, and that it was made 80% of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, and that it was not inclusive. And then I still continued on warning when they had the coalition, and when they had its leader Mu'az al-Khatib, who criticized the US for listing al-Nusra as a terrorist group. And I've been critical of all of these. I have blamed the regime for not doing the change, for not doing any democratic change and move towards democracy quickly enough. But I've also been warning from those Islamist groups, from arming those Islamist groups, and saying that if you're going to arm them, you're not sure who you're going to be arming exactly. You're going to be arming a lot of groups who are mainly Islamist in nature, who are all being funded by Saudi, Qatar, and Turkey, and the only interest actually is to fund groups who follow their Wahhabi Salafist ideology or the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. And I've been saying again that all those ideologies share the same perverted ideology.
Well, unfortunately, your warnings were not heeded by many world powers and many power brokers in the Syrian conflict. Ribal, for the time being, we have to take a short break, but when we come back, the Syrian conflict was the first to expose fundamental differences between major powers. With that rift growing even wider now over Ukraine, what does it hold for the future of Syria? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart.
I know CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News have taken some knocks lately, but the fact is I admire their commitment to cover all sides of a story, just in case one of them happens to be accurate.
That was funny, but it's closer to the truth than you might think.
Excellent.
Because when politicians and the mainstream media work side by side, the joke is actually on you. At RT News, we have a different approach.
LOL.
Because the news of the world just is not this funny.
I'm not laughing, damn it, I'm not laughing.
You guys stick to the jokes. We'll handle the news.
Do we speak your language? Want news, programs and documentaries in Arabic? It's all here on RT. Reporting from the world's hotspots, VIP interviews, intriguing stories. Are you here? Then try RT Arabic. To find out more, visit arabic.rt.com.
Welcome to the future.
Science, technology, innovation, all the latest developments from around Russia.
We've got the future covered.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the Syrian conflict with prominent pro-democracy campaigner Ribal Al Assad. Ribal, just before the break, we were talking about the fact that you've been warning, Western decision makers about potential danger of arming the rebels. Obviously, those warnings haven't been heeded. But I would like to ask you something on that note. I mentioned the Hama uprising earlier, and it's interesting that when you look at how it is now represented in Western media, it's almost like it was a harbinger of the Arab Spring in a sense of it being a democratic movement. People fighting for democracy in Syria all the way back in the early 1980s. And there were very few mentions of the terrorist attacks that took place in Syria in the early 1980s. I'm talking about the killing of, several hundreds of cadets at the Aleppo artillery school. I'm talking about the car bombing of a girls' school that killed almost 200 people in 1981. And if you look at the early depiction of the Syrian conflict, again in Western media, there were very few mentions of the atrocities committed by the armed Syrian opposition early on in the conflict. My question to you is whether you believe this demonization of Assad and the glorification of the armed Syrian opposition that took place in the early years of this conflict was intentional on the part of Western media or Western politicians, or was it just, an act of ignorance on their part?
No, I think it was, there was a lot of active ignorance, of course, and it was the full image, of hope of change that we had in the Middle East. When people saw, people rising up against, the dictatorship in Tunisia, and then, again in Libya, I think it was just the image, of that dictatorship that has been broken around the Middle East. And this gave hope, of course, to a lot of youth who were without jobs, and a lot of there's economic crisis going on all around the world. So, of course, if it affected Europe, of course, it's going to affect the Middle East. But as you know, in Europe, there's democratic process. People have the liberty and freedoms to go in the street to demonstrate, and then change the government. And people are happy. They are happy and satisfied that they were able to change the government, even though the economic situation is not, it's not exactly, we cannot say that it's much better. But in the Middle East, we don't have this process. So people, the only person that they could go after is, the head of state. We knew from the beginning, yes, that they were armed Islamists, but it was the fault. We still blame some, big blame on the regime because they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't know how to move quickly towards change. They didn't know how to allow media, as you know. They didn't want to allow media the first few days to enter the country. They were blocking internet access. They were blocking Facebook. They were blocking a lot of things. So this, of course, as you know very well, Western media does not like, when it is not in the picture, when there's no transparency. And this is exactly what went on. If you remember, I was calling for more transparency and for allowing Western media to go in and see what was really going on the ground.
Okay, Ribal, with all due respect, I've worked in the media industry long enough to know that during other conflicts, the conflict in the neighboring Iraq, during the conflict in Afghanistan, there was very little transparency. The American government, the American forces did their best to limit the access of reporters to the battlefield. So if Assad is culpable, he is definitely not alone there.
First of all, I'm not American myself, and I do criticize the United States also for the mistakes they have done in Iraq.
Let me pick up on that front, because I would like to ask you specifically about the actions of the Western governments. I heard you say that regional players, Saudi, Turkish governments, were able to intervene to such an extent in the Syrian conflict, primarily because the West took a back seat and didn't intervene decisively. And my question to you, what role did you want Washington, London, Berlin, Paris to play? What could they have done differently to ensure a better scenario for the Syrian people today?
Yes, Oksana. The role that I wanted for Washington, London, Moscow, and Paris to do is to bring all sides, all people who genuinely, from day one actually, and say we have a conference and we would like to invite all sides who genuinely believe in democracy and who are ready to sign for it. Democracy under the rule of law, equality of all citizens under the rule of law, regardless of religion, sect, ethnic group, and gender, of course. And that would have right away isolated all those Islamist groups, because do you think that the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, or the Salafis are going to come and sign to equality of gender or equality of sect or of ethnicity? I don't think they would have, and we would have. We didn't have to deal with those Islamist groups from the beginning. They would have been outcasted. Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi would not have any groups to back.
Ribal, I think the template that you just laid out was pretty much espoused by Moscow. Moscow was very much in favor of political dialogue. There have been a number of prominent domestic opposition figures from Syria that came to Moscow time and time again, that there were efforts to bring them to the negotiating table. But I think the main geopolitical difficulty here was that there was insistence from the very beginning that the departure of Assad should have been a precondition. Do you believe that that was a mistake on the part of the Western governments to demand the immediate departure of Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah, I think there was, of course, a mistake from the beginning. But if we go back to those groups who were invited to Moscow and other places, I think they started inviting them too late. It was already too late. A lot of blood had already happened. I think they should have, from the beginning, they should not have allowed those groups, as I said again, that's the Syrian National Council or the coalition or whatever groups who, I don't even know how they were, what democratic process, they had to go through to be elected as a representative of the Syrian people. I think this on itself was completely undemocratic. But again, if we go back and look at what they were able to do, I think they should have come from the beginning. They shouldn't have said that that he has to move, that this was a precondition. I think that all sides should have, in the international community, not the people on the ground, they should have sat together and agreed that how we should move forward in Syria. So we could have seen from the beginning, and any regional actor should have understood from the beginning that this is not just, a regional conflict, that this is more, it has to do with the major powers. And if those major powers don't come together and agree a peaceful transitional change in Syria, that nothing is going to change on the ground. And I still believe it today.
Well, I don't see any actual prospect for them coming together. Whatever differences they may have 4 years ago, it looks like those differences have been expanded over the last 4 years. And this is one of the reasons why Syrian conflict has been pushed off front pages. We have another conflict in Europe this time around over Ukraine. Now, when I mentioned the two conflicts to the Ukrainians, and when I mentioned the similarities that I see between the situation in Ukraine and the situation in Syria to the Ukrainians, they get really uptight. They get really offended. They don't believe that you can compare the two. But I wonder if you see any similarities here, at least in the sort of geopolitical setup of those two conflicts.
As I said from day one, I knew from the beginning that this was not just a regional conflict, that this is much bigger than the regional conflict, and it just expanded, as you've just said. Unfortunately, the problem with Ukraine, I don't think that, I'm again against any, we should really not trying to look for escalation. I think the only, solution in Ukraine is a peaceful solution, because those people in Ukraine have lived together for thousands of years. They all, from the same country. They all have lived side by side. And today they should be able to resolve their, their differences between each other. I think they should, respect each other's rights. They should respect their full rights of citizenship. And, and I don't see personally that anyone should really intervene. They should be able, as Ukrainians, to resolve their problems and issues on their own.
I think we all agree on those points, but the problem is, of course, that when it comes to real geopolitics, values and agreements are not always upheld. I want to ask you, though, to what extent can the success or failure of the conflict resolution, let's say in Ukraine, affect the conflict resolution in your country? If Russia, the United States, the West, Europe, come together on the Ukrainian issue, do you believe it would perhaps improve chances of them finding a compromise on the Syrian issue?
Yes, I really think so. I really think that if the major powers work together into trying to find a peaceful solution in Ukraine, that, again, they would be able to work together into finding a peaceful solution in Syria. And I think it has in a way started a bit in Syria. But again, on the other side, I don't think that they could, a lot of people expect from Russia or from China to help on Syria while they are, they are having problems with Russia in Ukraine. They are having problems with the China in the South China Sea and the Pacific. So I don't, Russia and China do not look at these problems to be, isolated. They think that they are all interconnected and they should all be resolved together.
Well, it's all, at the end of the day, it's all an issue of international order and the rules of the game for all. I totally agree with you on that front. If I may squeeze one last question, over the last couple of years, I've traveled several times to Syria. I've talked to a lot of people, Syrian activists on the ground, and when you compare the Syrian activists who live inside Syria and who live abroad, they tend to have a very different understanding of the word freedom. To ordinary people in Damascus, freedom means going out with your family, going to a restaurant, going to a park without a fear of being killed. I assume to people like yourself, that means something else. You associate that with the political rights and so on and so forth. I wonder if it's not the time to put the freedom agenda aside. I'm not saying to cancel it altogether, but put it a little bit aside and focus on the peace agenda.
People from the beginning in Syria and all over the world actually have always looked, to be free, to have freedom of expression, to be able to say what they want. And, that is normal. They have always been looking for democracy that we have in the West and all over the world, because that's, they look at, we have satellite television today, we have internet, we have satellite phones, so people are able to see what's going on abroad, how people are living abroad, and people always want a better life. But today, after 4 or 5 years of the Syrian conflict, of course, people's ideas of freedom and democracy, I think it's not that they have changed, but it's their priorities have changed. Today, people do not have enough food. People today don't have electricity. People today are freezing. They don't have enough diesel to heat their homes. So a lot of over 3 million refugees abroad and over 6-7 million internally displaced. So of course, their priorities have changed. People today, they just want to go back to living the way they were living before this, the so-called Arab Spring. So this is what's going on. But to say that people do not want freedom, of course not. They do want it. But they are also aware, I think, that the freedom that they want is not exactly what those fighters or rebel groups in Syria, Islamist rebel groups in Syria, understand it. It took Europe hundreds of years to get to the democracy and freedom we are having today. And I think it's also going to take, a lot longer in the Middle East, because, as you know, there's a question of religion that's also a part of it. Islamic leaders should come together, religious leaders should come together and agree on a peaceful religion that we have, that Islam is all about peace. It's not about killing and hatred. So this has to start with that. And then we have to start educating people about freedom. A lot of people's understanding of freedom and democracy is I'm free and allowed to do whatever I want, to hit whoever I want, to shoot whenever I want, and to insult whoever I want. And this is not real freedom and democracy. Well,
I have to add here that your understanding of the readiness of the region and Syria in particular to democracy and democratic freedoms is a bit similar to the understanding of your cousin, who has been arguing all along, at least publicly, that Syria does need change, does need political, economic, other reforms, but that those reforms have to be gradual and that the pace of that change should be weighed against security concerns as well. Unfortunately, we have to leave this debate, this heated debate here. I really appreciate you being on the show. And to our viewers, please join us on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages. And I hope to see you again. Same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.